Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable. And the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why we've published our first book from Australia Institute Press. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Bob Brown, Sally McManus, Dr Emma Shortis, and Professor Brian Schmidt. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
After America is made on the lands of the Kure-Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. We acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hello, I'm Angus Blackman, and this is After America. The will he or won't he game over Trump's steel and aluminium tariffs is over. Turns out he will, despite the apparent offerings of the Australian government. Critical mineral supply, interest from multi-billion-dollar super funds, even a lazy $800 million down payment on the AUKUS subs. None of it was enough to spare Australian exporters.
Such a decision by the Trump administration is entirely unjustified.
Let's call a spade here. I mean, I think this is a dog act after over a century of friendship.
This is against the spirit of our two nations' enduring friendship and fundamentally at odds with the benefits that our economic partnership has delivered over more than 70 years.
And if the Australian government hadn't got the picture already, it surely must have now. The America that we thought we knew is gone. Trump does not care if his actions damage the United States' traditional allies, us included. And for a country that's held the United States at the centre of our foreign policy for 80 years, that's going to require some pretty serious recalibration. This week on After America, I'm delighted to welcome back to the show Dr Ruth Mitchell, who joined Dr Emma Shortis in conversation last week. Ruth is a board member of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN. She's also a neurosurgeon at the Sydney Children's Hospital and the Prince of Wales Hospital, and the chair of the board of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, the first woman to hold that role. I know, right? They discussed how her native Canada has responded to the tariffs, what America's decision to sell out Ukraine means for efforts to abolish nuclear weapons, plus Brainworm Corner. Here are Ruth and Emma now.
Ruth, welcome back to After America. It's so lovely to see you.
It's great to be here. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Emma.
Oh, it's our pleasure to have you always. And hey, some stuff has happened since you were last here.
Yeah.
Just a little bit.
Oh my goodness.
What do you make of it all, Ruth? How are you coping? Listeners might have picked up that you're Canadian as well, so you have a particular connection to two of the United States' traditional allies that are being attacked by Donald Trump. How are you going? What do you make of it all?
Well, it's an interesting time in so many ways. I mean, I think living in Australia, we often feel very far away from, what's happening overseas. And I think sometimes we get this idea we might be exempt from the consequences of world politics, but it's sort of becoming apparent that, it might all be getting much closer and be much more relevant than we want it to be. And I guess I get a bit of perspective about what's happening in this new season because most of my family live in Canada. And so I get these updates from my mother and she will tell me what the weather is doing. And then she'll tell me what Donald Trump is doing, in the same text. And that's because it's having such a huge impact north of the border. So, the Canada-US border is the longest, undefended border in the world, this huge, long 49th parallel and then some wiggly bits. And it's a really significant, long-standing friendship, relationship, a whole bunch of trust and reciprocity over a very long period of time. And now, Donald Trump has had the unique ability to unite Canadians. it's actually extraordinary. Like, everyone's like elbows up, and the consequences are so profound of what he's done, saying like we're having tariffs on everything coming from Canada. And one of the things that Canadians have done, and it's been, coming from mayors and premiers as well as federally, is actually, no, we won't be buying American products in these categories. So, for example, all the American bourbon's been pulled off the shelves in, massive big, like Canadians pretend they don't drink, but they drink, you know what I mean? And so there's big categories of products that Canadians aren't even buying now from the United States. They're sending all the Jack Daniels back to Jack Daniels land, like clearing it off the shelves. There's a real coming together and like, no, we're standing up against this. And there's a new prime minister in Canada. And, generally it's held that the reason why he was seen as the right person to lead the Liberal Party was that he was the best person who could stick it to Donald Trump. Like that was the criteria. Like that was the main thing he needed to be able to do. And so, I contrast that to like the discourse I hear in Australia, and everyone's like, oh, don't poke the bear, don't anger him. Oh no, let's play nice. And I can't help feeling that that's like a little bit naive. And so I'm just intrigued by who's saying what, right? And I'm really interested, particularly, I think one of the people who said, oh, no, we don't, we don't negotiate with bullies. I don't know exactly what he said, but the vibe was, I'm not taking this on board, was Malcolm Turnbull. Fascinating.
In the imperial capital, they regard deference as their due. So if you go to Washington, or indeed to Beijing, or in the old days to London, and you grovel and carry on and suck up, they just say, oh, that's great. Is it time for the next sycophant? Surely he's had his 10 minutes of sucking up. It is crazy. You win no respect at all. And of course, with Trump, who is like the ultimate narcissistic, blustering bully, it is the worst possible thing to do.
And so I was just very intrigued by that. I wonder what you've been thinking about all of this and how Australia is responding.
Yeah. The response in Canada is evidently very popular, Ruth, as you've just said, having a stronger response kind of in the Turnbull framing, standing up to a bully. And I think it's been interesting to see the language is changing coming out of the Australian government. It is getting stronger. The Prime Minister has said this imposition of tariffs is not the act of a friend. I'm paraphrasing, of course. Ed Husick called the imposition of tariffs a dog act, which I thought was particularly nice. And so the language is changing. But then I think, my other response, and I actually wanted to get to this with you, is that, Australia, the Australian government, Australia has a long-standing commitment to the international rules-based order. And imposing retaliatory tariffs goes against that international rules-based order. And if you start doing that, if you start making exceptions to your commitment to the rule of international law, then where to from there? What does that mean about Australia's role in the world? And I don't think we're really having that conversation or connecting Trump's broader attacks on the international rule of law to what he's doing around trade. And I think that's a real concern for me, is that they're seen as separate things when they are, I think when it is a concerted attack on the international rule of law.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so in so many ways, like when we spoke last, which was after the election, but before the inauguration, I remember reflecting on the fact that Trump is not a friend of multilateralism, and he's not ever shown himself to be a big friend of a treaty. He thinks it's all about a deal, but a treaty is a different thing. And so his disregard and disrespect for that kind of international rules-based order and for also, the norms of how we engage with our neighbors. I think it's perhaps one of the big contrasts between how Australia is feeling in this season and how Canadians are feeling is that so far, I haven't checked the news this morning, but so far, Trump hasn't threatened to take over Australia as American territory. And so
not yet.
Not yet. That's the thing. So it's just not yet. And so Australians thinking that we're so special and it wouldn't happen to us I think it's probably a little bit naive to think that we couldn't be on the receiving end of some of these more insulting things, like annexing Greenland and making Canada the 51st state. Are you kidding me? Super upsetting, and disregard for sovereignty. That sort of respect for how the international system works is really a hallmark of how he's been doing business.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that is kind of encapsulated or symbolized, or however we want to describe it, in that meeting that Trump and Vice President JD Vance had with Volodymyr Zelensky in the White House. And that approach to allies, to sovereignty, to the international rule of law is really sending shockwaves through the United States traditional allies and Europe, of course. And it does, Ruth, to me, it looks very much like Trump is ending the world order as we know it. Do you think it's that big? Do you think the international rule of law is collapsing?
Well, I think that his direction of travel is definitely away from multilateralism, away from respect for international law. But I think there's a larger context that this is happening in. And the temptation is to pin it all on Trump and be like, he's the bad guy. He's absolutely responsible for the whole. That's nonsense. Like, this is a kind of a symptom of a system that's been undermined already. I mean, some of the undermining occurred when he was president the last time. But there's also, I think, the international rule of law has been weakened horribly in the last, 16, 17, 18 months with what has been happening in Gaza and the lack of consistency in interpreting and upholding international law, and people who have for a long time, been very keen to talk about human rights, civil liberties, international humanitarian law, the rule of law, the international legal environment, absolutely abandoning it because they're, into human rights except for Palestinians. And we've seen our own government fail spectacularly in this regard. We've seen other countries who would like to market themselves as upholders of, human rights and being progressive, way forward kind of countries just be completely missing in action. There have been exceptions, shout out to South Africa, big respect to Ireland. But the clear, strong voices of like, hang on, this applies here, have been few and far between. So I think that it weakens the response that people can now make to say, oh, Trump's being so disrespectful of international law. It's like, so were you. This is the price you pay for not being consistent. This is the price you pay for relegating international humanitarian law to the fiction section of your library. Is that then you don't actually have a leg to stand on when you want to complain about someone being a bully or belligerent or selective in who they stand up for or who they, whose rights they protect, I guess. So I think that's the context in which we have to grapple. And so I think for me, it's really interesting to note that on one hand, you have this erosion of our international system and international norms. And on the other hand, you have a whole bunch of great people doing great things together. And so I think about, last week was the third meeting of the states parties of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And that happened in New York, the same New York where, Trump's got his tower and his empire and everything else, like the same New York. It is actually a very different New York where at the UN, civil society voices and countries who've signed and some who've ratified this treaty saying we don't want any more nuclear weapons, we must work to a world free of nuclear weapons, got together and did that international, collaborative, norms-based thing of like building consensus and building agreement and imagining a better world than the one we've got right now. And I think it's really important not to lose sight of the fact that these things are happening in parallel, and that there is a resistance to this deterioration and this decay. And I want to really focus on the voices that are coming out of that are the ones that we haven't been hearing in the international spaces enough. So one of the pieces of work that happened at that gathering of the TPNWs, like they call it the MSP3, Member States Party third meeting, is some work on, how do we respectfully engage the voices of survivors of nuclear weapons. So there's a whole set of protocols that have come out about how to engage with affected communities respectfully with, integrity and humility. And that kind of discourse couldn't be any different than the, shouting at Zelensky about what he's wearing, in the White House, like outrageous behavior. And in contrast, you've got a space where survivors of, Soviet nuclear testing in Kazakhstan and British nuclear testing in the South Australian desert can get together, share their stories, explain their journey, and together help guide the community in figuring out how to talk about these things in a way that's culturally appropriate. I mean, you couldn't have a more different set of conversations occurring basically the same week. And so I think that that's why it's so important to keep an eye on what's happening on the margins. There's so many things about whether you want to call it community or society or civilization, where it's like it's kind of dying at the center, but it is coming alive at the edges. And we've got to make sure we're hanging out at those edges, that we're bearing witness to that and we're telling those stories, because it's a potent antidote for despair to be part of those conversations, even if only virtually, and so it's very important to see that there's more going on than just these like marginally legitimate leaders would have us believe.
Yeah, I think that's such a beautiful way to frame it, especially because at the center, so often questions about kind of strategy and nuclear weapons are treated like a game. It's kind of important men playing games in offices, and that's something I actually spoke to the Ukrainian ambassador to Australia about last week, and he spoke about the role of nuclear weapons in the conflict in Ukraine and in the world, particularly if the ceasefire in Ukraine fails.
So what we see now, we really have stopped nuclear non-proliferation, because other countries now paying attention to what is happening and figuring, well, maybe we need nuclear weapons as a deterrent. So if we get more nuclear weapons, where are we going? I mean, what's the danger of the destruction of the world? Very high, because if more countries have nuclear weapons, the more dangerous it becomes. So we are in a very dangerous situation currently, and certainly nobody wants to have a World War III. However, we need to make sure that, aggression is not rewarded.
Do you think that the quote unquote lessons to come out of a potentially failed ceasefire in Ukraine will mean that other countries, and of course we're talking about the center that you just described, will continue to resist denuclearizing, or even potentially look to build their own nuclear arsenals because of, as a result of this invasion?
Yeah, I think that the direction of the discourse in Europe is super distressing right now. And every time that, one of the privileges of being part of something like the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War is every month we get on an executive committee call, and I get to talk to my colleagues who are in Europe, who are at the forefront of trying to have sensible conversations about nuclear weapons. And during, this last season, we've seen, new countries sign up to NATO who were previously like, oh, no, thank you. No, that's not for us. But are seeing that, including the nuclear posture of NATO, as something they need for their own security. And so we're seeing a real shift in people's understanding of security and the kind of security definitions and paradigms that people are embracing has actually shifted. It's shifted to the right. It's shifted to realist frameworks, away from the kind of human security, and in some cases even feminist security frameworks that have previously been a little bit more commonly held. And at the same time, you see this thing where, especially things like, International Women's Day and whatever else, everyone gets up and makes these wonderful statements about how they're, all about humanity. And at the same time, they're trying to strengthen their relationships with their nuclear weapons allies and partners. Yeah. And so I worry that the ongoing conflict in Ukraine is really making everyone forget their core and what the lessons of history have been, which is that you don't get anywhere with everyone just having more weapons, and particularly more nuclear weapons. And I think the thing that I'm always I think we know it, but we kind of keep forgetting, is that the only people who are benefiting from any of this are the arms companies. That's the only actual net beneficiaries of this. And so it's really important to track when our politicians have relationships with arms companies. And so this has become super relevant in the last week or so, because you find out about people who used to be Australian politicians being on the payroll of undeclared on the payroll of arms companies whilst doing things like running a museum. So, we all have power that we gain by having, titles and jobs, and it's about using your power for good. And so I think about that all the time. I think about, who's benefiting from all of this awful conflict, and who benefits from discussions about should we be becoming, various countries in Europe starting to, like, the conversation is softening about, maybe we need our own nukes, instead of just hosting US ones, which is already a terrible idea, and all the things we understand about that tell us that, if you have them, you're more likely to be a target of somebody else's. Like, there's no way to make your kids safe by having more weapons of that flavor. Like, this just doesn't work. And the only reason that they haven't been used on purpose or by accident in the last 80 years is dumb luck.
Yeah.
And I think this year in particular, because this is the 80th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In this 80th year, where we have just awarded the Nobel Peace Prize to Nihon Hadankyo, which is the largest organization representing survivors of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Hibakusha, the survivors, that group, 80 years of fighting for a world free of nuclear weapons, to honor them and to honor the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the victims and all the other victims of every nuclear weapons test here, on sovereign, unceded Aboriginal land in South Australia and, in the Pacific and in Kazakhstan and in the New Mexico desert and everywhere that they've been tested. We actually have to change that conversation. We have to center the discussion on those survivors and what their lives were like after they got through it, and on who died and who passed.
Yeah.
So I think about the fact that that's the discourse we need to be having, and those are the voices we need to be centering, and instead of just lining the pockets of an industry that has no soul.
No.
It's just, anyway, it's awful.
Yeah. Ruth, there may be an opportunity to do that, partly because of Donald Trump, because like with everything he does, he swings wildly between positions on nuclear weapons as well. He occupies this weird space where we've discussed the fact that he's not anti-war, but he also kind of trades off being anti-military industrial complex. And he has actually said that he wants to restart nuclear arms control talks with Russia and China. He's mused about halving the defense budgets of all of those countries, which would be an absolutely extraordinary step. We had a colleague on the podcast a while ago, Matt Duss, who talked about, lifting up and supporting Trump's best ideas. Is there a way to do that? Is there a way for Australia to play a role in, encouraging Trump's good ideas, like restarting arms control talks while pushing back on his worst instincts?
I wonder about that. I don't really feel like I have an answer for it. I think it seems like, it just makes your heart sore when anything sensible gets said, and then you think, oh, hang on a minute, consider the source. And I think it's hard to imagine having like a sustained, trustworthy, like dialogue go on that is of the kind of sustained nature that is needed to make change. Getting, international, like bilateral or multilateral agreements in place and treaties in place takes years of negotiation. Generally speaking, some things happen faster than that, but most things don't.
Yeah.
And to get to the point where everybody's like on the same page requires real commitment to relationship. Even if it's, I'm here in this conversation because of my own interests, and you're here in this conversation because of your interest, but we're going to stay in the conversation because we're committed to getting through this together. And so I think while it's really hard to imagine that kind of process happening with Trump as one of the prime movers, it does seem like it would be nice to find a way to make the most of when occasionally the stopped clock is right twice a day. So when occasionally something like truly excellent gets said that we agree with, which is like, it is an absolute waste of money to spend so much cash on military when, you've got a lack of clean drinking water in some of your communities, when you've got great huge islands of like these food deserts, you know, in all kinds of communities where people can't even access like groceries. When you've got such significant social needs and a lack of like public health care and all this other stuff, and all that's being eroded, that's what money is for, like, is for all that stuff, right? And so, you know, when he occasionally makes a good point, I'd love to find a way for us to use those words without sounding like, because I feel like if you say, well, Trump said this, then you sound like an idiot immediately, right? And you're like, everyone's like, oh God, what happened to her? Has she had a stroke? Actually, does she have a brainworm? Like, those are the kind of conversations you start having, right? Like, I can't believe you just said something like that. And yet it seems a shame to waste any opportunity we might have to shift the discussion. And so, you know, it's like, you know, the first time Trump came to power, there was an analogy which I found really helpful, which is that like everyone thinks they're at a boxing match, but Trump knows that it's actually like mixed martial arts. Like it's some kind of, you know, it's one of these things where actually the job is to bring in a chair and break it over your opponent's head, even though chairs aren't allowed. But like, who cares? Like, I'm here now, so I'll make the rules. Yeah. And so that disruption is almost always destructive. There may be, you know, best case scenario, a chance for that disruption to bring in at least loosen up the discourse and make it so we can have a fresher conversation. I'm not super optimistic, I'm going to be honest.
You don't sound it. And Ruth, I can't resist following up as well on our favourite owner of brainworms, because, you know, you spoke about public health there and that as a question of security. And of course, one of the other ways that Trump and the Trump administration is undermining, attacking security is through public health. Last time we spoke, RFK Jr. had, I think, been nominated, but the confirmation process hadn't started. He is now the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. How do you reckon that's going?
So I think it's going how we thought it would. You know, we've got a measles outbreak, I think, in Texas.
Yep.
People are dying of measles in Texas. That doesn't have to happen, you know? And so like at the 11th hour, he's like, oh, everyone get vaccinated, because he realizes that like, if he doesn't say that, he's lost any skerrick remaining of legitimacy. But, you know, things got to this place because he's at best a vaccine skeptic and like at least some of the time has been very opposed to vaccination.
COVID vaccine successful in saving millions of lives?
I don't know. We don't have a good surveillance system, unfortunately.
We don't know?
I don't think anybody can say that. If you show me science that says that.
You know, Bob, you say, if I show you, you're applying for the job. I mean, clearly, you should know this. And that is, the scientific community has established that COVID vaccines save millions of lives, and you're casting doubt.
So I think things are going as we thought they would. And it actually highlights how important leadership is and how important public health is, that you can have messaging be the basis for people like dying. Like you get the wrong message out there and the most vulnerable, and it's not just like anyone, it's the most vulnerable members of the community who, when they get an infectious disease that is preventable by vaccination, those will be the ones that die. So it's a massive justice issue. And the other way in which it's a justice issue is that the people who are most susceptible to this kind of like unscientific thinking and messaging are people with poor health literacy, which intersects with socioeconomic class and whether someone speaks English, all that sort of stuff, right? So it's like a justice issue on so many levels. And I guess the probably in the public health space, the most distressing thing that is having repercussions around the world is basically defunding, like basically collapsing US aid.
Yeah.
And so there are entire programs all over the world that are basically USAID funded. And so the collapse of those programs that look after things like, you know, tuberculosis treatment and prevention, that kind of thing is having devastating effects all over the world in places that we don't hear from and we don't hear about routinely. Like, no, you know, it's not getting picked up. You know, you have to be in the like dark reaches of like what used to be Twitter to find these messages about disasters happening. And so the full story of the impact of that isn't really being shared or told, but it's devastating. And so I think one of the things I've had to grapple with is like, I have to reluctantly acknowledge that the US has been doing quite a lot of good in various ways. and you have to give credit where it's due. And certainly there are problems and ulterior motives in some of the places that US aid has been deployed, but recognizing that the significant investment in various very resource poor environments has made a big public health difference in the past, which we're now appreciating because it's gone. That's the friend we want to have in the United States. Mm-hmm. And so what you asked before, is this the end of multilateralism? What is Trump doing? And I think what Trump's doing more than anything is changing the relationship all of us have with the United States. So none of us can continue business as usual in how we think about the United States. And the kind of world superpower energy, that's actually changed significantly, because the ways in which that power has been shored up over the years is partly that hard power, like military might, all that nonsense. But it's also a lot of the soft power stuff, like the partnerships with development projects, with aid projects, and then all the scientific collaborations. Mm-hmm. And a good number of those are under threat because there's all these buzzwords that are considered woke. And so now that's all canceled. There was a picture of the Enola Gay, which is, of course, the aircraft that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. The photo of that aircraft and the airman or whoever it was next to it there were moves to delete that from, a government website because it had the word gay in it. There are research grants for work on transgenic mice that have been canceled because of the word trans in there. So there's this craziness happening, which is going to affect not just research, biomedical research and other really important research in the United States, but it affects all these projects are international. People have international collaborations. Science is an international sport. You know what I mean? So that's having an impact on how people are doing research elsewhere. Because often a little part of a research project that's happening, in the United States is also happening in Australia, for example. So the impact's going to be felt here in Australia and Australian universities. And the best case scenarios, the best and brightest come and work here with us. But I don't think our university sector is equipped to welcome and fund and support the world's best, refugee scientists from, a former superpower. We're not ready for that. We're not ready to provide that kind of leadership. So I think we're only just seeing the tip of the iceberg of the places where the impacts are going to be felt. It's pretty depressing.
It is, Ruth, and I think you're right that we're not ready. But maybe the small source of optimism, I think, like you, I'm not particularly optimistic, but the small source of optimism is that we can be ready. And as you said earlier, maybe this is an opportunity to start really rethinking what we mean about security and the role in particular that Australia plays in the world. I have so many more questions for you, Ruth, of course, but I know you're incredibly busy in this pretty incredibly busy, crazy time. So thank you so much for your generosity and your time. Yet again, I'm sure we're going to ask you for more of it in future.
Thank you. It's always a delight to talk to you, Emma. And I always feel slightly better about things knowing that there's, smart people like you who I can at least debrief with about the universe.
Thank you, Ruth. Right back at you.
Talk to you soon.
This episode was recorded on Thursday the 13th of March, and no doubt a bunch of stuff will have happened since then. If you want to read more from Emma, you can check out her essay, Daddy Issues, Finding Ourselves in Trump's America, in the latest issue of Australian Foreign Affairs magazine. Find it via the link in the show notes or in all good bookstores. If you're enjoying After America, please let us know. You can reach out to us on social media. We're at australiainstitute.org.au on Blue Sky and at the Oz Institute, that's written AUS, on Twitter and Instagram. You can also send us feedback and episode ideas to our email address, podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation, and our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. We'll be back next week. I'm Angus Blackman. Thanks for listening.